Stop for a second and think about something real. Every time you fill up your gas tank, every time your grocery bill comes out higher than you expected, you're feeling the weight of a system built in 1974, hammered together in secret between the United States and Saudi Arabia, and for 50 years, almost nobody in America talked about it. Until now. Right now in 2026, that system is cracking open, and the crack has a very specific shape. It runs straight through the Strait of Hormuz, and it's being filled with Chinese yuan. If you're learning something here, please hit subscribe. I've spent months researching what's coming between 2026 and 2030, and I put it all into an ebook called The Next Global Shift, How to Stay Ahead of Economic Collapse and War. The economies, the conflicts, the moves you need to make. If you want my ebook, link in the description. Let's get into the video. You cannot make sense of today without going back to August of 1971, when Nixon did something that rattled the entire financial world. He ended the gold standard, walked away from it entirely, and told the world the dollar would no longer be convertible to gold. Panic followed, and legitimately so, because if the dollar isn't backed by gold, what on earth is backing it? Nixon and his Secretary of State Henry Kissinger already had the answer, and the answer was oil. By 1974, Kissinger sat down with Saudi Crown Prince Fahd and worked out an arrangement, and here is where a lot of people get the story wrong. No single document declared that Saudi Arabia must price all oil in dollars forever. What actually existed were two separate agreements, and the second one stayed buried for decades. The public agreement covered economic cooperation between the two countries, while the secret one, which Bloomberg News only uncovered in 2016 through a Freedom of Information Act request, offered Saudi Arabia military aid and weapons in exchange for investing oil profits into US Treasury bonds. And that's when the whole machinery clicked into place. Saudi Arabia priced its oil in dollars, other OPEC nations followed, and by 1975, the entire cartel had adopted the same standard. Every country on earth that needed oil, which meant every country on earth now needed dollars first. And the result was a permanent artificial demand for the American currency baked directly into the global economy. The gold standard was dead, but the oil standard rose to replace it, and economists gave it a name, the exorbitant privilege. America could print dollars, and the world would absorb them. American deficits that would have destroyed any other nation became manageable overnight. Military presence across the globe became affordable. All of it rested on one simple fact, that oil moved in dollars, and everybody needed oil. That was the petrodollar, and it ran the world for 50 years. Now jump to June 2024, because something happened that received almost no coverage in mainstream American media, which is itself a story worth thinking about. Saudi Arabia let its petrodollar commitment quietly expire, chose not to renew it, and moved on. Around the same time, the dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves dropped to roughly 57%, down from 71% back in 1999, hitting its lowest level since the IMF began tracking the data in 1995. China had already been laying the groundwork. On March 26, 2018, the Shanghai International Energy Exchange launched yuan-denominated oil futures, and within a single year, that contract became the third most actively traded crude oil future anywhere in the world, capturing roughly 14% of global market volume. Russia, after Western sanctions hit in 2022, redirected its oil trade so aggressively that, according to Russia's own energy ministry documents, only 5% of Russian oil export settlements still runs through dollars, while 67% now settles in yuan, one figure that deserves a proper pause. By 2025, analysts estimated that roughly 9 million barrels of oil per day were settling completely outside the dollar, meaning 1 in every 5 barrels of oil on Earth no longer touched the American financial system. The petrodollar wasn't dead, but as one analyst put it, it was no longer the only currency in the room when oil changed hands. And then February 28, 2026 arrived. The United States and Israel launched strikes on Iran, and Iran responded by doing something that had never happened once in the 52-year history of the petrodollar. Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz and then turned it into a toll booth with a very specific payment requirement, Chinese yuan, or cryptocurrency, but absolutely not dollars. The geography here matters enormously. At its narrowest point, the strait runs only about 33 kilometers wide, narrow enough that you could practically swim the crossing, and yet 20% of the entire world's oil supply moves through that channel. Japan depends on it for 75% of its oil. India pulls 60% of its supply through there. China draws 40%, one narrow passage, and Iran shut it down. By mid-March 2026, Iran's Revolutionary Guard had formalized what started as a wartime maneuver into a permanent structured system. By the end of March, Iran's parliament voted it into law. At least 2 vessels had already paid the yuan toll and passed through, with a Chinese maritime services company handling the financial mechanics as intermediary. Every single one of those transactions bypassed the US banking system entirely, settled through CIPS, which is China's cross-border interbank payment system, and their functional alternative to SWIFT, invisible to American financial surveillance and completely outside American reach. Deutsche Bank captured the stakes in a note to clients, writing that the conflict could be remembered as the key catalyst for erosion in petrodollar dominance, and the beginnings of what they call the petrodominance. Now here comes the part that genuinely surprises people, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. When the Iran war broke out, the dollar index surged to 2026 highs. The dollar went up. Global crisis still drives capital toward the dollar as a safe haven, and that short-term dynamic is real and powerful. But Commerzbank analyst Volkmar Bauer pointed to something that changes how you read the whole picture. The Gulf region's share of global oil exports has fallen from 55% in 1980 to less than 35% today, and semiconductor trade now rivals petrodollar flows in total scale. In 2020 and 2021, more integrated circuits moved globally in dollar terms than crude oil. His conclusion landed hard. For the dollar, it is now more important that computer chips are traded in dollars than that Gulf oil is traded in dollars. The petrodollar, in other words, may already be obsolete in the way that older technologies become obsolete, not through sudden collapse, but through the world quietly building roads around it. What Iran constructed at the Strait of Hormuz carries real financial weight, not just symbolism. Analysts at the Oil Report estimated that the Hormuz toll system could generate between $7 and $10 billion per year in revenue, a figure that lands in the same range as what Egypt earns annually from the Suez Canal. Iran built a competing toll booth at one of the most critical shipping lanes on the planet and priced it in yuan. Underneath that toll booth runs an infrastructure China assembled over years. CIPs processed an estimated $28 trillion in transactions in 2025, up from just $3 trillion in 2018. The BM Bridge platform, a digital currency payment system connecting the central banks of China, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Hong Kong, and Thailand, processed more than $55 billion in transactions by November 2025. The same month, the UAE executed its first government payment through it. None of this is theoretical anymore. The alternative plumbing exists, runs at scale, and handles real money. A fair and honest account of this story requires acknowledging what the yuan is not. Yuan holdings account for under 2% of global foreign exchange reserves, and no single currency sits positioned to replace the dollar. China carries its own paradox here. Full yuan internationalization as a reserve currency would actually cost China its trade surplus advantage, which means Beijing may not want total yuan dominance at all. What they want, as one analyst described it, is not yuan dominance, but dollar independence, meaning options, alternatives, the ability to root around the American financial system when the situation calls for it. The deeper signal worth watching is what central banks are buying. A combined 2,082 tons of gold purchased in 2023 and 2024, the fastest accumulation pace since World War I, compared to an average of just 473 tons per year between 2010 and 2021. Russia, China, India, Turkey, Poland, all of them systematically reducing dollar holdings and stacking fiscal gold instead. None of that is a bet on the yuan. What it represents is a global backup plan taking shape slowly but with real commitment. Here is what this means for you, for Americans living through this moment right now. One analyst put the dollar's purchasing power loss plainly. $100 held in dollars since January 2020 now buys $79 worth of goods. You have already felt this at the pump, at the checkout counter, in your retirement statements. The petrodollar system allowed America to export some of that inflationary pressure, to print currency and have the world absorb it because they needed dollars to buy oil. As that mechanism weakens, as alternative payment corridors grow and more oil moves without touching the dollar, that pressure gets absorbed at home instead. Anyone telling you the dollar collapses next month is selling panic, not analysis. The depth of American capital markets, the institutional trust built across generations, the sheer gravitational mass of the dollar system, none of that disappears overnight. But the direction of movement is no longer in dispute. And the Iran-China yuan move represents the most operationally specific challenge the petrodollar has faced since Kissinger sat down with Prince Fahd in 1974. Previous arguments about de-dollarization lived in academic papers and policy conferences. This one has a geographic choke point with ships already paying the toll, a functioning payment rail in yuan, and a parliamentary law backing the whole arrangement. The oil report captured what makes this structurally different from all the arguments that came before it. The petrodollar does not need every barrel priced in dollars to survive. It needs the marginal barrel to have no alternative. And the moment alternative exists and work reliably at scale, the structural demand for dollars begins to erode. That erosion is not theoretical anymore. 1 barrel in 5. And the number is moving in one direction. This is the video today. If you want my ebook, link in the description. See you later.